The Galactic Council chamber had not been this quiet in years, and the silence had nothing to do with respect. It came from disbelief. Moments earlier, the Draven Dominion had destroyed another frontier defense line, and the projections on the chamber's display left little room for comfort. 3 inhabited systems were about to become undefendable. And then Commander Daniel Hayes, the sole human representative in a room built for empires, said that Earth could cover all 3 systems. The laughter started before Chancellor Vorik even had to ask the obvious question. He asked it anyway, holding up humanity's official military registry for the entire chamber to see. 2,846 warships. The Council had more than 80,000, and it was still losing ground. Vorik wanted to know exactly how one modest fleet from one modest world intended to defend half the Council's territory. Daniel didn't raise his voice. It doesn't. Confusion swept the chamber. Then he added the sentence that would end up rewriting everything the Council thought it understood about humanity. You asked how many warships Earth has. You never asked how many humanity can launch. Somewhere near the back of the chamber, a few of the older human observers didn't laugh at all. They didn't even look surprised. Ambassador Kale did not sleep that night, and by the time the second sun rose over the Council capital, he had already requested full access to Earth's military registry. He told himself he was simply being thorough. In truth, he needed to know whether Daniel Hayes had spoken out of confidence or delusion, and there was only one way to find out. The records confirmed exactly what Vorik had shown the chamber. Humanity possessed 2,846 officially registered warships, scattered across a modest defensive perimeter that barely covered its own core systems. There was no hidden fleet buried in classified budgets, no secret shipyard producing vessels off the books. Every intelligence estimate the Council had ever compiled on humanity agreed on the same conclusion. Earth was not secretly powerful. It was precisely as unremarkable as it appeared. Which made Daniel's calm all the more difficult to explain. Kale found him later that day in one of the observation lounges overlooking the fleet approach corridor, drinking something dark from a plain metal cup, watching the traffic of Council vessels move in and out of the docking rings as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Kale did not waste time with pleasantries. Your registry is accurate, he said. I checked it myself. Fewer than 3,000 ships. No hidden reserve. No classified fleet. So either you lied to an entire Council chamber, or you believe something your own records don't support. Daniel didn't look up right away. When he did, there was no defensiveness in his expression, only the mild patience of a man who had expected this exact conversation to happen eventually. Your records aren't wrong, he said. Your definition is. Kale waited for him to explain further. Daniel didn't. Instead he set the cup down and suggested, almost gently, that if Kale wanted to understand, he should stop looking at what Earth called a warship and start looking at everything else humanity had ever built. It was not the answer Kale wanted, but it was enough to send him back into the archives with a different question in mind. He began pulling industrial and civilian classification records instead of military ones, and almost immediately the language started to look strange. Buried among ordinary registries for mining vessels and cargo haulers were designations that didn't belong to any civilian framework the Council used. Emergency Response Vessel. Deep Space Security Platform. Colonial Protection Ship. Mobile Industrial Defense Unit. Individually, none of them raised alarm. A colonial protection ship might easily be some kind of orbital rescue craft. A mobile industrial defense unit could be nothing more than a reinforced mining rig. But as Kale kept searching, the categories kept multiplying, scattered across thousands of separate systems, each one small enough to seem irrelevant on its own. He tried to estimate a total and gave up twice, the number growing too quickly to feel reliable. Whatever this was, it did not resemble a hidden battle fleet. It resembled something built into the foundation of an entire civilization, spread so widely that no single report had ever captured its true shape. Kale sat with that thought longer than he expected to, because it raised a question far more unsettling than a secret armada would have. A hidden fleet could be explained by ambition or fear or a desire for power. But this, whatever it truly was, looked less like a weapon and more like a structure. Something deliberate. Something planned generations in advance. Hours later, Kale returned to the observation lounge with more questions than answers, and found Daniel exactly where he had left him. That was when Daniel's communicator finally activated with the message he had clearly been waiting for. Admiral Sarah Cole's voice came through steady and unhurried, betraying nothing beyond simple confirmation. Authorization confirmed. Daniel didn't ask her to repeat it. He only asked the question that mattered. How many answered? There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable, the kind of pause that suggested the number wasn't small enough to state immediately. "We're still counting," Sarah said. Daniel didn't react with alarm, and he didn't react with satisfaction either. He simply nodded once, as though the answer confirmed something he had already suspected, then closed the channel and returned his attention to the corridor of council ships outside the window. Cale, watching from across the lounge, understood that he had just witnessed something far larger than a diplomatic exchange. Whatever Daniel had triggered was not a single command sent to a single fleet. It was a signal moving outward through a network so vast that even the man who had authorized it did not yet know its full size. For the first time since the emergency session began, Cale found himself asking a question that had nothing to do with warship counts or registry numbers. He wanted to know what, exactly, humanity had built itself into. And more than that, he wanted to know why. The first changes were easy to miss if no one was looking for them, which was exactly why the Council nearly did. Across human space, ordinary activity began shifting in ways that seemed unconnected at first glance. Mining vessels that had spent years working the same asteroid fields suddenly broke formation and moved outward. Orbital construction platforms that had been building civilian infrastructure for decades powered down their assembly lines without warning. Long-range colony ships, the kind that carried families and equipment rather than weapons, altered course mid-journey and began accelerating toward coordinates that had nothing to do with colonization. Cale noticed the pattern before the Council's own analysts did, mostly because he had spent the last day learning to look at human traffic differently. What struck him wasn't the movement itself. It was how old some of these vessels were. Several hadn't changed course in decades. Some, according to the records, had been sitting dormant long enough that their activation alone should have triggered maintenance failures. Instead, they moved as though they had simply been waiting. He brought this to Daniel expecting an explanation involving rapid conversion, some emergency program retrofitting civilian ships into makeshift warships overnight. Daniel shook his head before Cale even finished the thought. "They're not being converted," he said. "They were always built this way." Cale asked what that meant, and Daniel explained it as plainly as he could. Much of humanity's civilian infrastructure, from mining platforms to colony transports to industrial freighters, had grown up alongside something the Council had never accounted for. Built into many of those networks were defensive vessels and systems that had never been classified as part of any standing navy. Under normal circumstances, they protected mining routes, colonies, industrial zones, and the long-haul traffic that moved between them. Under emergency authorization, those scattered defensive assets could mobilize as one coordinated network, while the mining ships and colony transports around them shifted into a supporting role, clearing routes, relaying signals, and keeping the response moving. Cale found this difficult to accept, not because it seemed impossible but because of what it implied. No civilization built its entire economy around a hidden contingency without a reason serious enough to justify the cost. He asked Daniel directly why humanity would choose to build itself this way, spending generations designing an entire civilization around a possibility most species would never plan for. Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost some of its calm, replaced by something quieter and harder to read. "Because once we didn't." He offered nothing further, and something in the way he said it told Cale this wasn't a subject to press on yet. But the sentence stayed with him, turning over questions that had nothing to do with fleet numbers anymore. What had happened to humanity that made an entire species restructure itself around never being caught unprepared again? While Cale sat with that question, the numbers Sarah had promised finally began arriving. The first confirmed formation reached Council long-range sensors within the hour. 12,000 vessels, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested planning rather than improvisation. Cale watched the Council's tactical display update in real time, the number rising as additional formations entered detection range. Within another hour it had climbed past 31,000, still growing, still showing no sign of slowing. Then the sensors began picking up something else. Not new formations arriving but jump signatures, dozens of them, then hundreds, registering across multiple sectors simultaneously. Whatever was approaching wasn't coming from a single direction or a single fleet staging point. It was arriving from everywhere at once, as though an entire civilization had reached into every corner of its territory and pulled ships forward in unison. Chancellor Vorik, who had been the loudest voice laughing in the chamber only a day earlier, stood in front of the tactical display without saying anything at all. Cale had never seen him this quiet. Daniel's communicator activated again. Sarah's voice came through, calm as before, though Cale thought he detected something new beneath the professionalism now, a kind of restrained intensity that hadn't been there in the first call. "These are only the nearest systems," she said. "The rest are still inbound." Daniel absorbed that without visible reaction, the same measured calm he had carried since the emergency session began. But Kale, watching him closely now, understood that this was not the reaction of a man witnessing something unexpected. This was the reaction of a man watching a plan unfold exactly as it had been designed to. Kale turned back to the display, to the climbing numbers and the jump signatures still registering across sectors the Council hadn't even considered relevant to human territory. The question that had brought him here, how many warships did Earth actually have, no longer felt like the right question at all. The real question, the one that was only beginning to take shape in his mind, was how large a civilization had to become before it stopped needing a central fleet at all. And what, exactly, had convinced humanity that it needed to become that large in the first place? Daniel finally spoke again after a long silence, and when he did, his voice had none of the calm authority Kale had grown used to. It was quieter, more deliberate, like a man choosing each word carefully because the memory attached to it still had weight. "There was a colony called Haven," he said. "Small. Remote. Nothing special about it except that it was ours. Decades earlier, Haven had come under attack from raiders exploiting a gap at the edge of human territory. At the time, humanity's defense still relied on a single centralized navy, a proud and powerful fleet, but one that could only be in one place at a time. That fleet was engaged elsewhere when Haven's distress call went out, fighting a different threat the Council had never even heard about. The nearest major formation was too far away to reach Haven in time. Civilian ships in the region tried anyway. Freighters, transports, anything with an engine attempted to reach the colony, carrying whatever people were willing to fly them into danger without protection, without weapons, without any real chance of making a difference. Daniel didn't describe the battle. He didn't need to. By the time the Navy finally arrived, Haven was gone. What stayed with Daniel, what he said stayed with all of humanity afterward, wasn't the loss of the colony itself. It was the messages. Thousands of them, sent in the final hours, requesting help that never came in time. Some were official distress calls. Many were simply people trying to reach someone, anyone, before the end. One of the rescue pilots who tried to reach Haven and failed was a young man flying a civilian transport with no business being anywhere near a war zone. He survived. Kale watched something shift in Daniel's expression as he said the next part. "That was my father." He didn't elaborate on the details, and Kale understood, without needing to be told, that some of this was not meant to be shared as history. His father had spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of the people he couldn't reach, and he had raised his son on one sentence, repeated often enough that it became something closer to doctrine than memory. Distance should never decide who gets to live. Daniel said it simply, without any performance in his voice, and Kale understood immediately that this single sentence was the true foundation beneath everything he had been trying to understand since the emergency session began. It wasn't a slogan invented for propaganda. It was a promise made by people who had watched distance decide something once, and had spent every year since making certain it never would again. Humanity hadn't built a hidden armada to conquer anything. It had rebuilt itself, colony by colony, system by system, so that no distress call would ever again wait for a fleet too far away to answer. The classifications Kale had found buried in civilian records, the defensive networks spread across thousands of systems, all of it traced back to this one moment and the sentence it had produced. Kale sat with that for a while before asking the obvious question. "How long did it take to build this?" "Longer than I've been alive," Daniel said. "It's still being built." The tactical display behind them continued updating as they spoke, and Kale glanced toward it almost without meaning to. The count had climbed again. 94,000. The number no longer felt like a threat to measure or a mystery to solve. It felt, for the first time, like something closer to an answer, though Kale understood he still didn't have the full shape of it. He knew now why humanity had built this. He still didn't know how large it had actually become, or how far this distributed promise truly reached across human space. Daniel watched the display with him in silence, his expression unreadable, though Kale thought he recognized something in it now. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Just the quiet weight of a man who had grown up understanding exactly what those rising numbers were costing to maintain, and exactly what they were meant to prevent. Somewhere behind them, Vorik had stopped speaking entirely, watching the same display with an expression Kale had never seen on him before. For the first time since the crisis began, Kale found himself hoping the number would keep climbing. The Draven Dominion made its move less than an hour later, and for the first time since the crisis began, Kale watched Daniel's expression change into something closer to concern. Draven intelligence had clearly noticed the same rising numbers the Council was watching, and their commanders had drawn a conclusion that made sense from where they stood. If humanity was gathering ships in such staggering quantity near Council space, then Earth's own territory had to be stripped bare to make it possible. No civilization, as far as the Draven understood warfare, could project this kind of force without hollowing out its defenses elsewhere. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also completely wrong. Draven forces launched coordinated strikes against several distant human regions simultaneously, clearly timed to catch Earth's defenses concentrated in the wrong place. Kale expected panic. He expected Daniel to reach for a communicator, to redirect ships, to do something that suggested this development had caught humanity off guard. Instead, Daniel simply watched the reports come in, his posture unchanged, his voice steady when Sarah's transmission arrived moments later. "Multiple incursions detected," she said. "Local response already underway." Kale frowned, trying to reconcile what he was hearing. If the ships gathering near Council space represented Earth's primary defense fleet, then those distant regions should have been left exposed exactly as the Draven expected. Instead, Sarah's tone carried no urgency at all, as though she were reporting a routine matter rather than a coordinated invasion. That was when Kale understood his own mistake, one that mirrored the Draven's almost exactly. The 94,000 ships approaching Council space were never Earth's defense fleet. They were only the portion of humanity's distributed network that had answered this specific emergency, drawn from regions close enough to respond to the Council's crisis. Every other human region, including the ones the Draven had just attacked, maintained its own independent defensive network, built from the same architecture Kale had spent the last day trying to understand. The Draven had attacked expecting to find empty systems. Instead, local formations activated within minutes, drawing from the same embedded defensive assets that had been quietly present in every colony, every industrial zone, every stretch of human territory for generations. There was no central fleet to catch out of position because there had never been a single fleet to begin with. Kale turned to the tactical display and watched something the Council had never seen before. Separate defensive formations were appearing across human territory, each one responding independently to its own local threat, while the count near Council space continued climbing without interruption. The two events weren't connected by command. They were connected by design. The number near Council space passed 187,000 as the local engagements against the Draven concluded with unexpected speed, the attacking forces withdrawing faster than they had arrived once it became clear the expected vulnerability didn't exist. Vorik, who had said very little since the numbers began climbing, finally turned to Daniel with a question that carried none of his earlier arrogance. "How many fleets do you have?" Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. "That's still the wrong question." Vorik's expression tightened, clearly running short on patience for riddles, but Kale found himself understanding the answer before Daniel explained further. The Council had spent this entire crisis trying to count something that couldn't be counted the way they wanted it counted. There was no fleet number that would ever satisfy Vorik's registry, because the concept of a fleet assumed a single force that could be measured, located, and evaluated as one unit. Whatever humanity had built was not a fleet. It was closer to a nervous system, distributed across an entire civilization, capable of responding locally without waiting for instructions from anywhere else. Kale looked back at the display, at the separate formations still active across human territory and the continuously climbing count near Council space, and understood that he was no longer trying to answer the question he had started with. The real question, the one that finally felt like it mattered, was simple enough to keep him awake again that night. If these weren't separate fleets, then what exactly was humanity? The formations kept arriving through the night, and by morning the tactical display no longer resembled anything the Council had prepared for. It wasn't a wall of ships advancing in a single overwhelming line, the kind of spectacle Kale might have expected from a civilization finally revealing hidden strength. It was something stranger and, in its own way, more unsettling. Distributed clusters materialized across dozens of approach vectors at once, arriving in waves that seemed to have no central point of origin. Some formations were built from sleek modern vessels clearly designed for this exact purpose. Others were older defensive vessels, industrial in shape, built decades earlier to protect remote colonies, mining routes and deep space infrastructure, but maintained with obvious care. Fast response craft moved between the larger formations, coordinating without any visible central command directing them. Kale stopped trying to catalog individual ship types somewhere past the 200,000 mark. It no longer felt like the point. What mattered was watching an entire tactical philosophy unfold in real time, one formation adjusting the moment a neighboring formation shifted position, the whole structure behaving less like a fleet and more like a single organism responding to pressure from every direction simultaneously. The count crossed 300,000 before the Council's own analysts stopped announcing updates aloud, the numbers arriving too quickly to narrate. Then 400,000. Vorik stood motionless in front of the display, and Kale understood, watching him, that something fundamental had broken in how the Chancellor understood military power. He had spent his career measuring strength through registries and fleet counts, through numbers that could be compared, ranked, and negotiated around. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for a civilization that simply couldn't be measured that way. The final confirmed count settled at 500,000 operational vessels, and even then Sarah's update suggested the true total remained uncertain, more formations still registering from regions too distant to have arrived yet. Kale turned away from the display and found Daniel watching it with the same unreadable calm he had carried since the emergency session began, though something in his posture now seemed lighter, as though a weight he had been carrying quietly had finally been set down. "Why has no one ever heard of this?" Kale asked. "A civilization capable of this should be the most feared power in known space." "Because they weren't built to impress anyone," Daniel said. He said it simply, without any attempt to soften the answer or dress it up as humility. It was, Kale realized, exactly the kind of answer a man would give if the entire point of what he was describing had nothing to do with reputation at all. The Draven Dominion's response arrived shortly afterward, transmitted directly to the Council chamber. Their commander demanded humanity withdraw immediately, framing the gathered formations as an act of aggression against Council sovereignty, a threat that could not be permitted to remain in Draven-contested space. Daniel didn't raise his voice when he answered, and he didn't offer the kind of speech Kale had half expected given everything that had led to this moment. There was no declaration of strength, no warning about the size of what the Draven were facing. "Go home," Daniel said. "Every ship you can see is here because someone once needed help." Nothing else followed. No further threats, no elaboration, nothing that could be mistaken for posturing. The Draven advance continued anyway, their commander apparently unwilling to withdraw simply on the strength of a warning, still operating under the assumption that numbers alone, however large, could eventually be worn down through pressure and attrition. Kale suspected the Draven had misunderstood something even more fundamental than their earlier strategic mistake. They were treating this as a confrontation with a single fleet, when what they were actually facing was an entire civilization built to respond as one. Vorik finally spoke again, his voice quieter than Kale had ever heard it. "They didn't build an army," he said. "They built something that makes an army obsolete." Kale said nothing, watching the distributed formations continue holding their positions across the display, patient and unhurried, exactly like the man who had summoned them. Whatever happened next, Kale understood that the Council would never again make the mistake of measuring humanity by counting its ships. The Draven advance did not last long enough to become the battle their commander had expected. Kale watched the tactical display with the same attention he had given it for the last 2 days, but the shape of what unfolded now was different from anything the Council's own doctrine would have predicted. There was no single decisive engagement, no dramatic clash of main fleets meeting head-on. Instead, the Draven found their supply lines quietly isolated within the first hour, local human formations positioning themselves not to attack, but to cut off the routes the Draven needed to sustain any prolonged offensive. Threatened civilian systems were protected first, before any counterattack was even considered. Formations moved to shield colonies and industrial zones the moment Draven ships came within range, prioritizing what needed saving over what could be destroyed. Only after those systems were secure did the surrounding formations begin closing the space the Draven had assumed would remain open. There was no central command directing all of this. Kale confirmed that himself, watching how individual formations adjusted independently whenever pressure shifted from one sector to another. When a Draven strike group pushed harder against one position, the nearby human network simply responded, reinforcing without waiting for instructions from Earth or from any single admiral coordinating the whole effort. It behaved less like a chain of command and more like a reflex, immediate and local, spread across every point of contact simultaneously. The Draven commander, according to intercepted communications the Council managed to translate, grew increasingly frustrated by the absence of a target. There was no flagship to eliminate that would break the resistance elsewhere. There was no single decisive battle to win that would force a surrender. Every time Draven forces concentrated their strength against one formation, the surrounding network simply adapted, absorbing the pressure and redistributing it rather than collapsing under it. Kale understood, watching this unfold, that Daniel's earlier answer to Vorik's question finally made complete sense. The strength here was never a number that could be counted and defeated. It was 500,000 separate answers to the same emergency, each one capable of acting without depending on the others to survive, yet all of them moving with the same underlying intention. The Draven commander's withdrawal order came less than a day later, delivered without the demands or ultimatums that had accompanied his earlier transmissions. Continuing meant accepting losses that would only compound the longer the engagement continued, against an enemy that showed no sign of a breaking point to exploit. There was no catastrophic final battle, no overwhelming display of destruction. The Draven simply recognized the engagement could not be won on any terms they understood, and pulled back before the cost became irreversible. Vorik watched the withdrawal confirmation appear on the display without speaking for a long moment. They didn't lose because Earth destroyed them, he finally said. They lost because Earth never gave them anything to destroy. Kale found Daniel near the observation window shortly afterward, watching the same withdrawal reports with an expression that held no triumph in it at all, only the quiet stillness of a man who had expected this outcome and felt no need to celebrate it. Sarah's transmission arrived a few minutes later, her voice carrying the same measured calm it always had, though something in it now sounded closer to relief. Final count verified, she said. 500,012 vessels responded. Daniel didn't ask about the number. How many systems were left uncovered? He asked instead. There was a brief pause before Sarah answered, and Kale found himself holding still, sensing that whatever came next mattered more than anything the tactical display had shown so far. None, Sarah said. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, just for a moment, and Kale understood that this single word meant more to him than the 500,000 ships combined. The number had never been the point. The point was that number, whatever it turned out to be, existed to guarantee this exact answer. Kale looked out at the distributed formations still holding their positions across human territory, patient and unhurried, already beginning the long process of returning home now that the crisis had passed. For the first time since this had all begun, he understood that he had been asking the wrong question from the very first day. The formal session convened 2 days later, once the Draven withdrawal had been fully confirmed and the Council's attention turned to the matter of updating its records. Vorik stood before the chamber with humanity's revised military assessment already prepared, ready to replace the old registry number with something that finally reflected what everyone had witnessed. 2,846 warships would become 500,012. A correction, he called it. A number the Council could finally trust. Kale asked him to wait before submitting it. He had spent the last 2 days trying to understand why that correction still felt incomplete, and only that morning had he finally found the shape of it. The old number had never been wrong, not in the way the Council assumed. It simply measured something that didn't apply to humanity the way it applied to everyone else. And the new number, however accurate it might seem after everything they had witnessed, would fail in exactly the same way. Because the moment the Council wrote down 500,012 as humanity's true strength, they would be doing the same thing Vorik had done from the very first day. They would be trying to count something that had never been meant to be counted. Kale found Daniel afterward in the same observation lounge where so much of this had unfolded, watching the last of the distributed formations begin their long journey home. There was no ceremony to it, no formation flying past in review. Just ships quietly turning and departing, one sector at a time, exactly as unremarkably as they had arrived. Did you build this because you were afraid of another haven? Kale asked. Daniel considered the question honestly before answering. At first, he said. He watched the departing ships a moment longer before continuing, his voice quieter now, the same quiet Kale had heard when he first spoke his father's name. Eventually we built it because we realized nobody should have to wait alone. Kale let that settle before asking the question he suspected mattered more than any number the Council could write down. What do I tell them then? If 500,000 isn't the real answer, what is? Daniel didn't answer with a number. He didn't answer with a name or a threat, or a warning meant to intimidate anyone still listening. Tell them not to measure us by what they can count, he said. Tell them to measure us by what they can't. Kale returned to the chamber that afternoon and submitted a different assessment than the one Vorik had prepared. Where the old registry had listed a simple number of warships, the new record carried no number at all. Human defensive capacity, distributed. Total response capability, unknown. Strategic warning, do not assume any human world stands alone. Vorik read it twice before saying anything, and when he finally spoke, there was none of the certainty he had carried into the emergency session days earlier. That's not a military assessment, he said. That's a warning. It's both, Kale answered. He thought, standing there, of Daniel's father, a young pilot who had once flown toward a colony he couldn't save, carrying nothing but the hope that distance might not decide who lived after all. It had that day. And so an entire civilization had spent every year since making certain it never would again, quietly, without ceremony, one defensive system at a time, until a number no one had ever officially counted reached 500,000 ships answering a single call. Cale understood now why Daniel had never seemed impressed by that number, not once, not even when it crossed into territory that should have staggered anyone standing in that chamber. To Daniel, it had never been 500,000 warships gathered to demonstrate strength. It had been 500,000 ways to make sure someone answered. The chamber slowly emptied as the session ended, delegates dispersing to civilizations that would spend the coming weeks trying to understand exactly what they had witnessed, and failing to reduce it to anything simpler than what it already was. Cale remained at the window a while longer, watching the last human formation vanish from Council space, leaving behind nothing but empty sky where 500,000 ships had briefly stood. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, he found that the empty sky didn't feel like relief. It felt like reassurance. Somewhere out there, across a civilization spread farther than the Council had ever bothered to map, humanity was already returning to its ordinary work, mining and building and living quietly, each colony carrying the same silent promise it always had. Not a threat aimed outward. A promise kept inward to itself, that no matter how far apart its people scattered, distance would never again decide who got to come home. If you found yourself hoping that Count would keep climbing right alongside Cale, you already understand exactly what humanity's Armada is about. Subscribe and stay with us for the next one.